welcome to yet another session of the Benny Goodman broadcast. So we haven't come up with a name for this series yet. But what it is going session by session, starting with Benny Goodman, 1934, with what they called his music hall band, with George Van Epps on the guitar, Sammy Weiss on drums, and a wonderful early first big band of Benny Goodman's. And I have my two friends here from Arkansas, drummer, band leader Hal Smith, and from California, banjoist, vocalist, guitarist, Nick Rossi. Hey, Nick. And they're both
Hello.
Wonderful historians and students, not only specifically of their instrument. And we started this just in the conversations I had with Hal about Sammy Weiss and Gene Krupa and early jazz drums. Nick and I have been going back and forth, started with Alan Roos and then talking about George Van Epps. So we started really kind of listening to these recordings through the vantage point of the guitar and the drums, but then expanded it, and we're kind of ranging far and wide. We'll say this disclaimer at the start of every episode, which is that this is not a discographical series. We do have our copies of Russ Connor's various books and their various incarnations laying around, but we leave the discography, the history, and some other aspects to those experts. Our vantage point is, for the most part, musical and kind of just talking about the rhythm section and the horns and the way they play. So it's by no means definitive in that sense, but it's definitive, we hope, from our perspective. So that's the story. We've been working our way session by session. And today we come to the last of the Columbia sessions. And just to recap very, very briefly, Benny Goodman started recording for Columbia Records with this band. He recorded before some very famous sessions on August 16th, 1934. And it was called Benny Goodman and his Music Hall Orchestra. So we listened to it session by session. We also heard two studio sessions where the personnel was taken from the Goodman Band. And that was Harry Rosenthal and his orchestra, November 14th, 1934. And also Vincent Rose and his orchestra, the Modernists, September 11th, 1934. And the supposed all-star European date of October 16th, 1934, and you can go back and listen to those and catch up on all those various things. So today, again, we go to the very last of the Columbia sessions, February 19th, 1935, four titles: Singing a Happy Song, Clouds, I Was Lucky, and Night Wind. And the personnel for this will be posted while we listen to the first track if you want to see it. I'll just read it out loud. And again, these are kind of guesswork. But Russ Connor's guesswork, and that's about as good as it gets. So it's, well, maybe guess isn't right, but anyway. There were no records kept at the session as to who was on it. Pee Wee Irwin, Ralph Buzillo, Jerry Neary, trumpets, Jack Lacey and Red Ballard on the trombones, the reeds of Toots Mondello, Jaime Schertzer, Dick Clark, and Art Rollini, Fred Froba on the piano, George Van Epps on the guitar, Harry Goodman on the bass, and we're already into Gene Krupasville, Gene Krupa on the drums. So let's start with the music, and then we will get our conversation going here. This is Singing a Happy Song. I believe it's the first arrangement that Benny has recorded in the studio by Spud Murphy, and we'll talk about that when we come back. So here we go. They're coming to get me, but I'll get the track in real quick.
When you're singing a happy song, you hear the birds singing and bells ringing, and you find what a joy they're bringing, 'cause you're happy when you're singing a happy song. Are happy when you're singing a happy song.
You know, Loren, you asked me on the last session if I had wished the guitar was a little more audible. And on this session already, I wish it were. I think you know, one of the things we've talked about is how the musicians were moved around the studio, and I'm hearing the guitar pushed a little bit in the background. And part of it's I think the effect of Gene Krupa really taking charge rhythmically in the section, which is great to hear. As a guitar player, it gets a little frustrating trying to hear what George Van Epps is doing. But there's still some really nice moments. And when you do get to hear George, I'm hearing him play a lot more staccato than we've heard him play on previous records. A little more of a clipped sound in his guitar. A little more aggressive. You know, we talked about what that means in this music in previous episodes. But, you know, George was such a relaxed player most of the time that it's kind of interesting whenever you hear him dig in a little bit more. Once again, you know, Harry Goodman, to my ears, Harry Goodman's sounding great on this. And he and Gene really seem to have quickly formed a pretty good bond in the rhythm section, which is going to outlast George's tenure with the group, which is not too far off in the horizon based on the discography.
Yeah. Hal?
I was so happy to hear Gene playing those press rolls. The touch he had reminded me of Paul Barberin with Louis Armstrong during that same period. Every drummer plays those rolls differently, and Gene would come to play them his own way, but that really sounds like Barberin on Jubilee or some of the Armstrong records from that same period. He played a little choke or splash or whatever you want to call it on a very small cymbal that would disappear in the near future. He'd hit an open cymbal crash or a choke cymbal and hit it harder. That's kind of a leftover from the 20s dance band sound, and that's one that he dispensed with, and to good effect, I think. I was interested to hear him switch to brushes behind the vocal and then back to sticks. And he also used the hi-hat, obviously with very small, thin cymbals at several points there in transition and briefly behind a solo. But that's what Gene is going to be doing in large part in just a few months, and that will become his signature sound, all of those things.
Well, you know, I've seen, we should talk that this was, I should mention that this was arranged by Spud Murphy. And I've seen Spud's scores. Say that 3 times quick. I've seen Spud scores. Okay. And you want to watch your P's because they're popping a little bit there again. But but I've seen Spud's scores, and they are unlike any other in the Goodman library. First of all, they're multicolored in terms of how he would write. He would write the name. So to begin with, those scores. I'm trying to think if this has worked its way into the discographies or not. Maybe not. I'm not sure. Should have thought of this 30 years ago. He lists who's in the band, and he dates them. So it's what a great resource that is. And then they are sometimes written in a color or underlined in a color. And also his style of orchestration. I don't know how to describe it, but I think of all the arrangers writing for Goodman at this point, like he's the most... his palette is wider in terms of counterpoint and voicing and like the accordion like sound of a band than the other arrangers, and they're fine arrangers. But Spud is after something else. He's very readily identifiable, and I'd say after those early Benny Carter scores that we heard so many of, or not so many, but we heard in mid-1934, probably between Benny Carter and the arrival of Fletcher Henderson. Spud Murphy has a moment there throughout 1935 with some great arrangements. And this one, it was funny. Some of it sounded like standard 1934 big band, white big band fare, if you want to call it that. But then, was it after the vocal or somewhere, like he goes into like what seems like a more contemporary Harlem band style. And then I noticed at the end of the second A of what followed the vocal, like he ends on a ninth, you know what I mean, which is, very hip and unusual for 1935 to have a ninth chord with a melody on top. So, it's just worth underlining the quality of these things. Also, Helen Ward, and this is one of the great things about Facebook, because, Hal, Nick, you're both, have posted so many interesting things, based on original research that you do. And another friend of ours, David Fletcher, and actually I don't want to start calling names because we'll leave someone out. But among the things, that have come up were things I'd never seen about Helen Ward. I guess it was David Fletcher, I think, who found these things. Even before she joined Goodman, and like she was a wonderful pianist. I mean, I'd heard that she was a complete musician, but seeing that she was already known, Miss Helen Ward of 1809, Onogda Lane or whatever, when she was still living at home, plays the piano and does this and does that. And I can hear that musical quality in her singing. She doesn't have the strongest voice of singers in those days, but there's a musicality to it, that I kind of find really kind of like overwhelming. Let's go to the second title. This is Clouds. And we can talk about this guy when we come back. Fudd Livingston. Arranged by Fudd. And anyway, this is Clouds.
The night was young, the breeze was warm and tender. A fool was I, but how was I to know? I gladly gave my heart in sweet surrender, to learn that love was meant to come and go, like snow white clouds floating through the night. speaking of a love that was heavenly, a love that could never be mine.
Did you all notice how undance band-like the drumming was at the beginning there? Came on really strong playing press rolls. That's not something I'm used to hearing from other drummers of this era playing with dance bands. They might dial it back a little bit, but Gene was right there making it happen right at the start. It's wonderful. And he again switched to brushes behind the vocal, then came back to sticks and brought the intensity back up again. And I hear that's the second title where I've heard Frank Frobo playing a little bit busy behind the vocal, kind of foreshadowing what Jess Stacy's going to do in a few more months.
Yeah.
And I don't hear Harry Goodman and George Van Epps as well as I'd like to on that particular side. I know they're there. I can feel their presence, but they may have been moved around or moved farther back from the mic for some reason, or Gene is more prominent. I don't know what it is, but it's a wonderful feeling, the four of them playing together, but I wish I could hear more of Harry and George.
You know, just seconding a comment you made on the previous track, I'll bet you anything that Gene is really reading that drum chart. And at one particular point, if there's a, or whatever he does it, where I'll bet you in later years as he got going, not that he didn't read the arrangements, but he just would totally reorchestrate it with one of his trademark things.
He'd play a rim shot or an open cymbal crash,
right.
Or if he did play a choke figure, it would be on a slightly larger cymbal and he'd really hit it. Yeah. That's coming in a little bit later in 1935, I think.
Yeah. One more question I just have to ask you. Krupa appears on that TV show Chicago and All That Jazz, right? And he plays with Pee Wee and those guys. And I've seen him do it on other things where they get to the end of a tune. Oh, no. They start a tune. He does a cymbal crash. He goes like, pow. And then he goes into it or something like that. Is that a Chicago thing, or is it just an old dance band thing? I've never known what that was.
I think that's what Condon said to do. He probably said, Gene, bring us in. That's my guess. And notice also that's one of the few times he had one of those Chinese-style cymbals. He used a swish cymbal from Zildjian, but he didn't start using those until the 60s. He'd never had one before, where almost every dance band and jazz drummer had a big Chinese cymbal. He never had one.
Yeah.
For some reason. I don't know why. It would have been great if he'd played one.
Yeah. It's funny, on that particular show when they're playing and I see Condon go like this, and he's playing the guitar, and I always wondered if that was to loosen it up, you know what I mean? Like those guys were kids together, just like all us musicians, I guess. They had little gestures and little things that they would do that meant something. It could also be that his back itched, but
I think he was just enjoying the music. That's what I've always thought when I've seen that. Like he's really in it now. This is exactly what I want to hear. That's just my guess.
Yeah.
It's not a guitar technique, I can tell you that much. Put a little more wiggle in your strum. It's funny. I go back to what I said about the last track. I really think they've rearranged the placement of the musicians in the studio from the last session, from maybe the last couple of sessions, and you can think about what the circumstances around that are. I mean, clearly, with Gene being such a driving force, you don't need. For the record, you don't need that bass guitar momentum driving it as much as perhaps you needed on other sessions. So that could be one reason why I'm still with Hal. Yeah, I'd love to hear more of both Harry and George. I think it's one interesting aspect of George Van Epps. I think it's probably worth mentioning now is George was known to be a very selfless musician, and that he was very, very much one in service of the music in terms of his playing. I think there's a Howard Alden interview online, and Howard was one of George's latter-day students, and Alden talked about how George had fantastic technique, and yet he was always in service of the music. And that's what we're hearing on these kind of less than stellar examples of his playing. He's playing his role in the section, serving the music, not standing out, but playing well every time. Of course, as I said, and I think in our last session, as a guitar player, I'd love to hear more of what he's doing, just from an analytical standpoint, from just an interest standpoint. But I will say, it's the band in general sounds great. I mean, they've been playing the Let's Dance show for over 2 months at this point in time. The musicianship's high. They're able to execute things well as a unit. So even if they're reading down this chart for the first time or haven't read it down a lot, they're still making good music, which is enjoyable to listen to.
Yeah. And in the next session, the only one of the Victor sessions that Van Epps made, we'll see what happens to the balance there, because maybe the Victor engineers tried to capture something. I'm looking forward to that. I'll just mention briefly about Fudd Livingston. Fudd Livingston, great reed man, composer. He wrote one famous tune, Mahler's Fifth. And he also, no, I'm sorry, no, that's the wrong one. That's Fats Mahler. No, I'm all confused. I'm Through With Love is his tune with Matty Malneck. But a great clarinetist and arranger. He's on some of those early, he's with Ben Pollack, but the Red Nichols records, and a lot of those are his compositions. A really unheralded figure. Boy, it would be wonderful to have a bio or a real serious, deep musical thing written about him. And if there is, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of it. But anyway, yeah. But here he is arranging for the band. He'd been with Paul Whiteman in the early 30s. And this arrangement stands out because it has some unique characteristics to it in terms of voicings, intervals within the voicings, certain kind of counterpoint, just a sound. The sound of the orchestra there, by virtue of his arrangement, is different than this, very different from the Spud Murphy, and different from all the other ones too. So it's interesting. I think he wrote more for Goodman than Goodman recorded. It would be fun to hear those charts at some time. The vocalist is... I'm sorry.
You go ahead.
No, please.
Oh, a story of how he came to write I'm Through With Love. Do you know?
No.
I do. He wrote it for Norma Teagarden.
Well, tell people who Norma Teagarden is. Most people probably don't know.
Norma Teagarden was Jack Teagarden's sister, very, very fine pianist. And Fudd Livingston proposed to her in 1931, and she turned him down. And he went home and wrote that tune, I'm Through With Love.
Oh, man. Well, I'll bet you his descendants wished he had gotten turned down by a lot more women. So. The royalties on that one tune must be pretty healthy, But yeah.
Norma
fascinating.
Told me that.
You met Norma Teagarden?
I played with her, yeah.
Obviously. Well, let's digress for a moment. Where, what, how, when? That's fascinating.
I played with her when I lived in the Bay Area in the late 1970s, and she played at Washington Square Bar and Grill, and I used to go sit in with a snare drum and a hi-hat, and she had a group of younger musicians who liked to sit in with her, and one time one of them asked, can we play I'm Through With Love? And she said, oh, Fudd Livingston wrote that for me, and then she told that story.
Oh, my gosh. Well, she's a fine pianist. She's on a Commodore session in 1944, I think.
Yes, and also some Club Hangover broadcast with Jack's band.
Yeah.
Kind of a Bob Zerke style player. Very interesting.
Yeah. Oh, my heavens. Well, I mean, Jack had most people know about Charlie Teagarden, his brother, the trumpeter, but there was a drummer too, right? A younger brother, Clovis or Cubby or...
Cubby,
Yeah. Did you ever hear
and
him?
Mama, too. Mama sat in on piano. She was a very fine ragtime pianist.
My gosh. Did you see? You're too young to have seen Jack Teagarden, I think, right? He died in '64.
I'm too young. I did see Mama Teagarden play. She played her two ragtime tunes that Tickled to Death and Possum and Taters. I saw her in Los Angeles play those two tunes.
That's great.
But those were the only two tea gardens I got to hear live.
Well, I think that's two more than Nick and I ever heard. All right, let's go to the next track. I was telling Nick as we were getting ready for this thing that this tune, whenever I hear this tune, it's in my head for weeks. It's a beautiful tune. I don't know that much about it. Maybe you can tell something about it. Another Spud Murphy arrangement sung by Helen Ward. This was "I Was Lucky," and I'll just underline these things by saying that so far none of these really have that Benny Goodman stamp that I guess is really going to come with the Fletcher Henderson arrangements. I don't know how many people would listen to these except for the Goodman solos and even recognize them as Goodman items. But yet it was this stuff that was really kind of bringing them to fame, I guess. Anyway, "I Was Lucky." Our third title from February 19th, 1935. "I Was Lucky," and that's a Spud Murphy arrangement, and I think you guys might agree. I mean, that's a real dance band arrangement in the sense of that there wasn't even an attempt to go to 4/4 or to swing it at any point. I was looking over in my Connor here, my Russ Connor, just looking over, what they were doing on the air during this exact time period around these record dates, and there's quite a bit of Fletcher Henderson happening on the Let's Dance broadcasts. I mean, there's a lot of it, and some Benny Carter. And if I look a little deeper, there might even be an early Jimmy Mundy, because he's already writing. Benny already has some Jimmy Mundy charts around this time. And yet these Columbia record sessions, for the most part, really are, you know, and with occasional little jazz moments. I wonder if, I don't know, you know, I wonder if that was their preference, or whether Benny knew he was going to Victor and he really wanted to save the goods. But a lovely arrangement.
I have to think that Columbia had a lot to do with the material. I mean, we've heard really similar material over the Columbia sessions, and you know, we're gonna find out soon enough. There's a shift when the record label shifts, which I can't wait to get into.
Yeah. What are some? I'm curious, Nick and Hal, what at this time period? So we're 34 into early 35. What other big bands do you listen to? I mean, we're focusing so relentlessly on George Van Eps and Sammy Weiss and Gene Krupa. But of that era, like, you know, the pre-36 era, even, you know, pre-35 area, what do you like to listen to? Which bands do you find interesting for guitar and drums and other reasons from this area, and why? It'll help us place things in context. Hal?
Well, I like Louis Armstrong for Paul Barberin's playing, and pretty soon after that would be Sid Catlett's playing. But that's about the most exciting drumming I can think of during this era. I do like Chick Webb, what I can hear of him on the records, and I like Ray Baduke with Bob Crosby's band. But those are the three that come to mind. And of course, Sonny Greer with Duke Ellington. But 1934 wasn't really a big recording time for them. They did a lot more, it seems to me, before that. And I always liked the way he played with Ellington's band.
How about Ray McKinley at this time?
He's wonderful. That session with Benny and Teddy Wilson, As Long as I Live, and all those. Yeah. But there's not much of him for another couple of years. And he did a session out in Los Angeles with Joe Sullivan and George Thau and some studio players. And he played marvelous drums, absolutely beautiful. New Orleans Parade, Shack in the Back, Finger Wave, and one other title I can't recall. But his star was on the rise. He wasn't there yet. With Jimmy Dorsey and the Dorsey Brothers Orchestra. Right. He's marvelous player. And so is Stan King. When you can hear him, he wasn't recording that much during this time. But, those are the guys I like to listen to from this era.
Whose session was that, the one that you just mentioned? Because I don't know those records. I'd like to hear them. The one of Ray Baduke Ray McKinley out on the West Coast.
That's under his name.
At that time?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, geez.
1936, I take it back. 1936. Yeah. And it's mostly Jimmy Dorsey sidemen.
Huh.
With Joe Sullivan on piano.
Oh, my heavens.
Yeah, they're wonderful.
For Decca or?
Decca.
Man, you hit upon something so interesting that it went right out of my head because I was thinking about something else. It'll come back to me. Nick?
Well, Hal hit upon some of my favorites as well. I do listen to a lot of Duke Ellington from this period, as I listen to a lot of Duke Ellington from every period. For me, historically, as a guitar player, what's really interesting about Duke's 1933, 1934 sides is you can hear Fred Guy on guitar rather well, unlike a lot of subsequent recordings. And part of that is Fred was coming from a different place than Van Eps, in that he was a professional banjo player for years before he switched to guitar. So it's interesting to me to listen to someone coming from that tradition and how that style differs. Fred also, I'm pretty well convinced that Fred played a tenor guitar on a lot of those Duke Ellington records from those years, which is a bit of an anomaly for certainly the black bands, if not most of the larger bands of the era. So I listened to a lot of Duke from the period. I love those Chick Webb records. I mean, they're a little bit ramshackle. They're not quite what if you read about Chick Webb, like so many of us have, and you hear all the legendary stories like we've talked about before. There's not quite enough there to really satisfy those kind of fantasies, if you will. But again, I mentioned John Schuhart before. He's I think such an important guitar player for this period, not in the least of which because he did influence Freddie Green so much, but just because he has a really interesting, unique style. I really like the Fletcher Henderson records from 34, although by this time, by 35, the Henderson band's broken up. And, from a guitar standpoint, you get Bernard Addison at the beginning of the year, who has his own unique style. And Lawrence Lucy at the end of the year for his style. So there's definitely a lot of good sessions. And of course, like all the small group sessions from this era, there's so many really good ones. I mentioned the Rollini one before from the end of 34, which is one of my favorites that features Van Epps. And a lot of those Dorsey Brothers sessions are really good as well that Hal mentioned. So,
yeah. Hal, I'm just curious, what can you tell us about drums in the studio at this time? What do you gather? A, could a drummer bring his own drum set? Or B, would he have to just deal with the studio drums? And also, once he got there, what kind of raps were they under? Or were they under raps? Sometimes I hear a lot of drums and I say, well, they could record them and they are recording them. And other times, you just read so many stories about they put them far away and they put a rug over the drummer and his drums, and all this kind of stuff.
I think a lot of that would depend on how easy it was to get to the studio. If I'm sure it's the same way today. If you're a drummer living in New York City and you have the option to go to a studio where there's a drum set up, you're going to do that. You might take your own snare drum and your own cymbals, but I imagine it's always been the same way. The less you have to take with you, just deal with what you're given to work with and tune it the way you want to hear it. I know what you mean about the muffling. I've seen many photos, even of drummers like O'Neill Spencer, who wasn't a very loud player, but the bass drum will have a string bass case over it, or a tarp of some kind, or a pillow pushed up against the front. And you kind of need that with those calfskin heads they had back then because they were very resonant. And most drummers played with a wool beater on the bass drum, which brings out more sound than felt or wood or cork or other materials. That's very hard to contain that kind of sound. Very few drummers in the photos I've seen used mufflers, external tone mufflers on their bass drum, so they had to control that with their feet. And in a studio, that would step all over a string bass if you didn't have the bass drum muted a little bit. You're hitting a low G, and the bass is walking, playing all those other notes, you're going to wipe it out.
Yeah.
So I imagine there was quite a bit of muffling going on, at least on the bass drum. The tom-toms of that era were not to the extent that we understand today as tunable. They might have the top head tunable, but not the bottom head. Or if it was an older studio, they might be those old tack bottom tom-toms that are not tunable at all. Probably a bunch of stands for the cymbals. I would imagine most drummers brought their own snare drum. That's kind of your signature. You like to carry that, and you can take that in a cab or on a subway and just deal with what else you're given to play with. It sounds like obviously they had a hi-hat in this studio. A few years earlier, there wouldn't have been a hi-hat. You would have had to bring your own if you even played one or owned one.
Yeah.
But this doesn't sound like a Gene Krupa drum set to me. This sounds like he's playing a studio set with maybe a couple of his own and his own cymbals.
Two more questions, one for you and one for Nick, just because some folks watching this, we're talking amongst us with terms that we all understand and most musicians would understand, but briefly, if possible, could you tell, and what I mean is because what I'm about to ask is like a whole show in and of itself. Calfskin. I know that many people are moved by the question, but what I love that. Well, what calfskin? What the hell is calfskin? It's calfskin, I guess. But,
It really is treated skin from a calf. That's what drum heads and banjo heads were made of in the from the time that such instruments started being available until the late 1940s, I believe, when plastic started being used instead of calfskin, because it would last longer and it wasn't affected by changes in temperature. Right. That's one big disadvantage of using skin, real animal skin on a drum set. If you leave it at the end of the night in a studio and the air conditioning goes off, the tone changes on the drums. If you come back in the next day and the air conditioning goes on, it changes again. Those studios, I'm sure, weren't air conditioned, but something a drummer would have to do at that point in time would be detune the entire set, and when he came back in the next day, start all over and retune every drum, because it's the property of the heads. They stretch and shrink according to the temperature. However, they're the best sound. There's no plastic drum head on the market that's ever going to sound as good as a calfskin drum head, especially on the snare drum for brushes. That's where you can tell the biggest difference of all. Yeah.
I mean, and I'm sorry about that bad pun before. It was an utter disaster. Okay, now that's Nick. You referred to a tenor guitar. Yeah. And actually, as you said it, I realized I don't know what that is. What's a tenor? I mean, what is it?
So a tenor guitar is a 4-string guitar. A standard guitar is a 6-string guitar tuned up in fourths. A tenor guitar is kind of the is it the antecedent? Is that the correct word? It's the descendant of the tenor banjo, in that it's tuned in fifths and only features 4 strings. The effect of it is that the chord voicings sound slightly different. The tenor tuning tends to be a little more cutting. The voicings are higher up on the staff, and so it's pretty easy to discern the two. You know, you can definitely, although there's some crossover in terms of what you can do on one guitar versus the other guitar, it's pretty easy to hear the difference between the two.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, thanks, gentlemen. Let's go to the next track, which I guess is the last one from the session. And this is Night Wind, which I fell in love with, the Fats Waller record with Bill Coleman. Yep. This is a different one. Helen Ward sings, and it is the last Benny Goodman Columbia record session until 1939, and that's a different Columbia anyway. So February 19th, 1935, we conclude with Night Wind.
up above. I'll be waiting there in the shadows till the night wind brings back our love.
Well, there's some good, strong press rolls again by Gene, and really made the band go. And he did something unusual for that era. He played the hi-hat near the beginning of the song. That generally wasn't done at that time. The hi-hat wasn't the primary timekeeping device yet. That would come. Obviously, it was still the rolls on the snare drum to keep time at this point. One of the few records I can think of offhand where you hear a hi-hat right at the beginning is the Alan Hawkins Orchestra of Shadows on the Swanee, where Walter Johnson, who'd played it earlier with Fletcher Henderson, the hi-hat, he plays it right at the beginning of the song on the introduction. That's very unusual for 1933, 34. It would be 36, 37 before you start hearing it right at the beginning of a tune, and maybe all the way through at times. And once again, Gene switched to brushes behind the vocal, and then back to those very strong press rolls to take it out, but hi-hat behind Benny. I find that very interesting, and changed the entire feel and the entire texture when he played those real washy sounding hi-hats behind Benny. And thank goodness Benny had a little bit to play on that one. Like that, yeah. He was signing off from Columbia saying, here's what you're losing. This is me. And what a nice little bit that he played there. Wish it had been more. Yeah. And Frank Froba sounded better too. Again, foreshadowing what Jess Stacy's going to be doing pretty shortly. He played more single note Armstrong style behind the vocal there and less of his flourishes. But that was a really nice sounding side, especially for the rhythm section. They sound like a really great group working together.
Yeah. I noticed also behind the vocal, when we heard the piano so well, I could hear the left and right hands. So, clearly, there was attention paid to that. The saxophones, all of a sudden, they sound like they're in another room. And it's not just that they're playing quietly, because the proximity to the mic definitely changed, because they come right back in after the vocal with a full 4 saxophone sound. And I've heard that in those days that they would actually have swivel seats, and that horn sections would sometimes swivel 180 degrees away from the microphone. And so either they did that, or I maybe you guys can talk about this. I'm not really sure. I know that records were mixed in those days. Going back to the Armstrong Hot Sevens and all that. There's someone's fiddling with mic levels, but during the performance. But I don't know if they could bring a mic in on a dolly, or they had someone with a boom and going like that. It really changes. Nick, with the guitar, boy, it's hard to hear. And can we lay it all
today?
Well, I'm just curious, can we really lay it at the feet of Gene Krupa to say, in other words, he's playing this, and therefore it's obliterating that part of the decibel range, or whatever the heck it is, or not, of the tessitura, unknown opera singer. But you know what I'm saying? But
yeah,
is it that, or is it that and mic placement? And here's something we'll never know, could, in some weird way, and Benny was fickle this way, he could have been like in one of those moods, like he could be with rhythm section players. you know.
Well, I think it's yes. The answer to your question is yes to all the above. I think it's Gene's assertion in the rhythm section. He's a strong player. He's got a really strong point of view rhythmically, and he clearly has no problem stepping out into the limelight. It had to have been sanctioned by Benny, right? I mean, he had to have been happy with Gene's playing. Otherwise, it may have come out different. I do think there's something going on with where the musicians are placed in the room, particularly on this session. I mean, I think we're hearing it a little bit in the other instruments as well. The first thing, sidebar, Loren, the first thing I thought about was maybe they moved Helen further away from the band, and that's why we're hearing, the band so far in the distance during her vocal. Oh. But yeah, I think the other thing to think about regarding George and the rhythm section is, maybe Benny was fickle. Maybe he just wasn't happy with the way the musicians were functioning in the section. I do think it's interesting that, George has been given zero space as a feature on any of these records we've listened to. Which is a little bit of an anomaly. If George Van Epps was on a session, particularly a small group, so we're talking a little bit apples and oranges, but up into this time and contemporaneously with these records, if George was on a session, he usually had a few bars here and there to play some sort of instrumental break. I know on the Let's Dance broadcasts, there are a couple of arrangements that have George featured. I think Making Whoopee is probably the longest or most significant arrangement. But if it was in that band book by this time, they certainly hadn't recorded it. And again, George, I think he was a bit of a passive guitar player in the sense that, he wasn't going to overly assert himself unless he felt like that's what was needed for the music. We heard it in other recordings where clearly there was some inequities going on with the rhythm section and someone really needed to step in and lay down the law, if you will. And you just don't need that with Gene Krupa, right? So I think it kind of points back to Gene, and not that I'm blaming on Gene. But we're gonna hear some more, and we're gonna hopefully hear him in a bit better fidelity. It's kind of interesting that you mentioned, Loren, you mentioned this last one was a 78 dub. I mean, my ears can hear definitely a little bit of a difference between, that last track that we listened to and the previous ones. You can hear the guitar a little bit better, but not much.
Well, with this, we say goodbye to Columbia Records, the Music Hall Orchestra. It was quite an evolution. I really enjoyed every one of the shows, and especially in some of the early ones. If someone just happens to be checking this one out first for whatever reason, there are wonderful moments from Van Epps and Sammy Weiss and Harry Goodman and Hank Whalen, and we go into great detail. I should say, for the most part, Hal and Nick did great detail on what they do on those earlier ones where they were right near the mic and where they could be heard, and so it's been quite an evolution and a fascinating one. So thanks, Hal. Thanks, Nick. And we'll be back as we launch into the Victor recordings.